Mr. President, I rise today to put the Senate on record on something very important, and that is speaking to the decision by the Obama administration to release 5 top Taliban leaders from Guantanamo Bay without consulting Congress, as required by law. A decision that I believe endangers the lives of American personnel, not to mention the countless Afghans, and the success of our mission in Afghanistan. It's been well reported in the press that this release was done without consulting Congress or congressional leaders on either side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat, by the way. And this was in clear violation of a requirement to provide detailed notice to Congress before such action is taken, a requirement that's contained both in an authorization bill called the 2004 National Defense Authorization Act and a spending bill, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2014, both of which, by the way, Mr. President, passed Congress with big bipartisan majorities. Both were bipartisan bills, and there was a bipartisan consensus about having this notification. Despite several closed-door briefings and public comments from the administration since we learned of the release, the administration has been unable to provide any legitimate justification for violating the requirement and for failing to consult with Congress. Now, I believe the President's conduct raises a lot of questions, and questions which should concern every member of this body, both sides of the aisle. It's not a partisan issue, nor is it about what kind of soldier Sergeant Bo Bergdahl may have been. That's not what this is about. I trust the Army will handle that matter appropriately. This is about our role in the U.S. Congress, and it's about our national security. It's about protecting our men and women in Afghanistan. It's about ensuring that what they have fought for over the last decade, the gains they have made in our nation's war against terrorism and for the people of Afghanistan, will not be squandered, as we're seeing today in the country of Iraq. Congress enacted the bipartisan notice requirement to secure those interests and to prevent the release of dangerous terrorists who are likely to rejoin the fight if they are freed. It requires the President to give a detailed justification for the release of detainees from Guantanamo Bay, why such a release is in the country's national security interest, what actions the administration will take to ensure that those released detainees do not return to the battlefield to threaten American lives, basically asking for the administration to come, notify us, but also provide a justification for the release and the conditions of that release. I believe, had the President followed the law, many of the dangers posed by this decision could have been avoided altogether. I think you would have heard on a bipartisan basis of the concerns of the United States Congress that were only voiced after the decision was made, again, on both sides of the aisle. Because, make no mistake, these 5 men who were released are dangerous. And don't take my word for it. This is what the administration has said repeatedly. I was there in a hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2012. I was a member of the committee at that time. Senator Levin, my colleague and chairman of the committee, who's here on the floor with us today, was at that committee hearing. In fact, he asked some very good questions, including questions to the President's own Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. And what did Mr. Clapper say? He reiterated a 2010 administration assessment that these 5 Taliban leaders, these same 5 who were just released, posed a high risk of returning to the fight. On this very point, Director Clapper did not equivocate, saying, and I quote, "I do not think anyone harbors any illusions about these 5 Taliban members and what they might do if they were transferred," end quote. This was sworn testimony before our committee. Even if the President admits that there is, as he has said, quote, absolutely a risk that these men will return to the battlefield. The President says that now. These men were senior members of the Taliban. They include the Taliban Deputy Defense Minister, the Deputy Minister of Intelligence, Minister of the Interior, some were closely associated with Osama bin Laden or al-Qaeda. 2 are wanted by the United Nations for war crimes. Yet despite these red flags, which according to reports in the press were reiterated during internal White House debates over the transfer, President Obama released these men anyway, without following the notice provided under law. We need to know why. We need to know what security risks these 5 individuals pose. We need to know what measures have been put in place to mitigate those risks. I don't know why any member of this body would oppose going on record saying that the law was violated and seeking answers to these good questions. In a moment, Mr. President, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent on a resolution that I have offered And many of my colleagues have co-sponsored, calling on Congress through regular order and committee jurisdiction to investigate the decision to authorize this release. This resolution has a very narrow purpose. It only seeks to ensure that when Congress speaks, and I remind you this provision on Guantanamo transfers passed in an overwhelming bipartisan manner, when Congress speaks that the President listens. This is not an issue of politics, and no matter what party the President is from, our entire constitutional balance depends on adherence to the rule of law. But this is about more than the President ignoring Congress. The American people are the ones who deserve these answers. We're their representatives. That's why that provision was put in place, so that we, representing them, could give the President better advice. But the American people deserve these answers. So do, by the way, our men and women in uniform who continue to put their lives on the line for us every single day. Already this month, since the release of these detainees, 8 American servicemen have lost their lives in Afghanistan. We still have over 30,000 troops in the theater. 30,000 Americans putting their lives on the line for us every day. I think a lot of them are wondering, what was the justification? Why? What effect will it have on them and their safety? One can hardly doubt that the administration's decision to release these Taliban leaders will put even more Americans at risk. And we should be under no illusions. If we take no action, I do not believe this will be the last unlawful transfer of detainees from Guantanamo Bay back to the battlefield. In other words, if we don't speak and go on record and say, wait a minute, we had a law here, this is wrong, we need a detailed justification, I believe the wrong message will be sent to the administration. The sense is Congress doesn't seem to care that we violated the authorization bill, the appropriation bill, and went ahead without providing the appropriate notice. President Obama has made it clear that closing Guantanamo was one of his top priorities in the waning days of his administration. I understand that. But he's provided no such clarity on what he intends to do with the dangerous men who are housed there. Men like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, principal architect of the 9/11 attacks, he's there. Will he be released? Into whose custody? The terrorist known as Hambali, the mastermind of the Bali bombing that killed 200 people, including 7 Americans. Ramzi bin al-Shabaab, a high-ranking al-Qaeda operative who helped coordinate the 9/11 attacks. We also need to remember why we went to Afghanistan in the first place. Of course, before 9/11, under Taliban rule, the country had become a haven for al-Qaeda, a power base for Osama bin Laden, and a place from which to plan and launch attacks against us, against the United States and our allies. We went to Afghanistan to seek justice for those who died on September 11th, but we also went to remove the Taliban from power, to free the Afghan people, and to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes this base, this platform for terrorist activity, which threatens us. We must not be blind to the fact that the Taliban aims to regain as much power as they can in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. That means a return to oppression, human rights abuses, the suppression of women's rights, and most importantly to us and our national security, the complicit harboring of their ally, al-Qaeda. We have just returned to them the leadership team to help them achieve that goal. President Obama tells us the war in Afghanistan is coming to an end. We need to ensure that that end is one of sustainable victory, not defeat. The deteriorating situation we see unfolding before us on our TV sets in Iraq today demonstrate what can happen when we rush to the exits without preparing for an appropriate exit. Today, the black flag of radical Islam flies over the second largest city in Iraq, and armed militants are advancing on Baghdad. Proclaiming victory in Iraq did not make it so. Many made it clear that if we failed to maintain appropriate forces in Iraq to help the government transition and establish its authority, the long-term stability of Iraq would be open to threats by radical groups. We chose not to complete an agreement, a status forces agreement, with the Maliki government. President Obama did not heed the warnings from those who saw these threats, and unfortunately, we are seeing some of these predictions come true. Whatever we do in Afghanistan, I hope we learn from the lessons of Iraq. The decisions to release high-ranking members of the Taliban, while the fight against Taliban continues to this day, has shaken the trust of the American people, the trust of the Afghan people, and it opens the frightening possibility that what we are seeing today in Iraq may be a foreshadowing of Afghanistan's future. Congress has a responsibility, in my view, to get to the bottom of how this release happened and to ensure it doesn't happen again. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support the resolution that I've introduced so that we can fulfill that responsibility. Mr. President, I said that I was going to offer a unanimous consent resolution. I will do so now. I ask unanimous consent that the Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 469, that the Senate proceed to its consideration, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, and I do intend to object to this resolution